Trailblazers, welcome back. Today we are doing team building for Content 101. So in all my guide videos, I do some base level teams, but I add this caveat that these are just generic teams which try to focus on in-game units that complement the character I'm reviewing. So for example, I'd say run a speed buffer with Well, or don't run a speed buffer with Clara. As such, I get these questions on my videos, such as if I have character A and B, will they pair well with character X and Y? And while it is difficult to, in my opinion, give a blanket advice of these four characters are going to work for everything, because TLDR, the answer is the content you're up against. That's just how it is for me. You can like the pitchforks if you want. I don't think the same four characters will work for everything, mostly because this is a gacha game, and so the different characters are designed to complement other characters' kits more efficiently. Some disclaimers: everybody does have a different threshold on how to build the quote-unquote best team. Some people think it's, the 1 million Zele damage teams, i.e. just kill an enemy before they kill you. And some people will opt for a more perma, well-balanced, moderate DPS, but with a never-ending Gapard shield, for example. And that's fine. The game is meant to be played at an individual experience. However, the focus point of all the content you build for is going to be your health bar versus the enemy health bar, with the goal being to drop the enemies quicker than yours drops. And so what I'll be doing today is covering the three pillars of a team, being your offensive support, your defensive support, and then your DPS, and then breaking down how we can slot each of these into one of our teams. And obviously in team building, we do only have 4 slots to work with, and where the challenge mainly comes in is that while we do have these kind of 3 pillars, they're broken up into even more distinct role types, such as with DPS, you've got single target and AoE. With defensive support, you've got healers, shields / tanks. And then with your offensive supports, you've just got a range of different offensive buffs and debuffs to play around with. Now, 2 of these roles in particular are a bit more complex, being the combo of bringing a main DPS or a sub DPS, and then the other one is just working out which support to bring, because like I said, you've got some supports that deal buffs, you've got some supports that deal debuffs, you might even want to pair up the same supports, and again, we only have 4 characters to work with. So today's video is going to comprise 3 main sections. We're going to cover off the core of team building in Honkai from my perspective. We're going to start with outgoing versus incoming damage management to cover your defensive options. Then we're going to cover off when to slot in a support and what each support character does. And then finally, we're going to be picking out our best DPS, which is usually when I focus on things like weakness and resistances. Also, please note, this isn't a who to pull / who to invest in video. That's a separate topic in my opinion than how to actually build a team. And so this really is the fundamentals of how I personally put my teams together. When I do the team building later on, I will only use free-to-play characters because everyone has them. Otherwise, we could just spend a whole day just building various teams for the fun of it. Okay, so incoming versus outgoing damage, aka your defensive options, also known as shielders and tanks / healers. To avoid having your health bar absolutely ripped into, you're going to need survivability in pretty much every team comp, otherwise every bit of damage your DPS takes on the health bar is going to be permanent and you'll be playing a losing game. When thinking of team comps then, I recommend firstly remembering the following must-have slot usages, which will be a DPS plus a strong shielder, or a DPS plus a shielder and a healer. I have seen some content pushing out just a DPS and a strong healer with no shielder, and that is a viable option if you're confident with your team building. But if your healer has no form of strong damage mitigation / they can't keep up with healing AoE attacks, for example, you're just looking at a very quick way to get absolutely terrorized by the enemy content. So, 1 DPS plus 1 very strong healer at your own risk, completely up to you though. As it stands, there is no content, to my opinion, where you need to run something like a turtle comp, which would be overkill on something like 1 DPS and then like 1 healer / 2 shielders. This style of comp is just going to make things slow for you and not enjoyable. To be honest, it is honestly up to you which shielder / shielder and healer combo you go for. Now, I'm throwing around this phrase like strong shielder and strong healer. Basically, what does that mean? So obviously, if you're in an AoE fight, someone like the Fire MC or Gapard is going to be a stronger option for you than someone like March 7th, because if the enemy is dealing out these massive AoE waves, March will not be able to keep up with the constant onslaught of damage, and so arguably she's the weaker selection. Additionally, someone like Bailu has a bit more flexibility in just applying overall heals because of her bounce mechanic, whereas Natasha is a bit more targeted and she can be a bit energy hungry. So, it does depend on your relics and your light cones, etc. I won't go too much into the actual details of each character, but there is this element of sometimes one option will be the stronger pickup than another. Something also important to remember when picking your shielder is actually the position you put them in, so which slot. Basically, if they taunt an enemy who has a cleave attack, the adjacent ally can also swallow some of that damage because obviously a cleave has an area of effect. And so if you take March 7th, for example, and you shield her and she is in slot 2, you're also looking at your slot 1 and slot 3 being able to take damage because of the way this cleave works. And so what people typically recommend is taking your shielder and putting them on either side of your team comp, so slot 1 or slot 4, to then limit the sides of which this AoE can take effect. Again, this only applies to cleave damage. You won't be able to just fully mitigate AoE damage. So with defense balanced, let's cover breaking down how to actually put a team together, because what you often get is this generic sentence of team building should be 1 to 2 DPS, and then this healer / a shielder, and then your supports, which if anyone's decent at maths, you'll realize that this is already up to 4 characters before you've even picked your support. On top of that, you'll then also get multiple options for support, such as running Pela with Bronya to lower defense and boost your attack, or running Welt with Asta to lower enemy speed and boost your own. So you're looking at getting inundated with all these optional support characters that you need to try and find a space for, but then you're trying to juggle them with your DPS and your shielder. Again, to me, survivability and dealing damage is a bit more important than support, but at the end of the day, supports really kind of are where the heart is because of the way that they improve your team synergy or emphasize certain elements of your DPS. So very quickly, for offensive supports in Star Rail, we have Pela, who reduces defense, Asta, who can buff speed and attack, Tingyun, who is an attack buffer and flat energy regen, Welt, who can imprison / reduce speed, and then Bronya, who can buff damage down and give your DPS another turn through advanced forward. Obviously, with all these characters available to you, it seems ideal that you would want to put as many of these in a team, but again, I keep running back to this generic point, it really does depend on the content itself. Additionally, on top of all your supports, you do have a combination of certain light cones and relics to extend what each character does. So for example, in my Welt guide, I mentioned that you can put the 4-star resolution light cone on him, and that's going to let him debuff defense as well, giving him a bit more viability. This doesn't necessarily mean that you would pick Welt over someone like Pela for defense breaking, but it just gives you a bit more slot efficiency when deciding on which support you can pick. So you can see that there's obvious value in picking a support, and if you've ever played Genshin, there's a reason why, someone like Bennett has kept his relevancy over the years. In Final Fantasy X, there's a reason Riku is put alongside 2 top tier DPS, and in Persona, it's why you see people building like resist and drain skills on their characters instead of going all out DPS, or even running someone like Makoto / Yukiko and Teddy. The list goes on, but supports have a very important function in a team, and so they do offer a lot of benefit. You just need to know when to pull them. Now, it does pain me to say, but supports, like I say, can be optional. They do increase what you're already doing, but sometimes it can be better just to raw dog damage with a more wider DPS coverage, i.e. opting for a main DPS and a sub DPS, especially in fights where there's like 3+ targets. And then sometimes it can be better just to double down on the defense, so picking a shielder and a healer instead of one or the other. Additionally, when thinking of offensive supports, unless it's someone like Welt who can also function by throwing out DPS, I'd never really bother going down the route of ever having more than 2 of these on a team. There are some examples where combos work really well, such as Bronya and Pela / Welt for letting your DPS pick off enemies, or Welt and Asta for a complete speed lockdown, but generally when you fall into 3+ supports on a team, you find yourself in a very specific niche team comp, like the Seele speed shutdown comp, and it's not a good general advice to go that way when you're actually building a team together. Overall, for supports, you'll see in a moment when I do some team building, while they are nice to have, and they definitely have a lot more value in my opinion than DPS. Like, I think you should invest more in your support. Sorry to say, don't come for me, but obviously if I'm doing generic team building advice, while it probably would do better YouTube analytics wise to be like, build for maximum DPS, I don't think in all team comps supports have as much value as being able to actually just deal damage and survive damage taken, and so they are kind of a flex pick when you can slot them in. That's just how I feel about them, unfortunately. However, when they can be slotted in, they are amazing and they will just make your life so much easier. Now, knowing when to pick the right type of defensive and offensive support is one thing, but something that you will not be able to escape from is picking a DPS or the right combination of DPS. DPS standing for, I think it's like damage per second, but your damage dealer. So picking your DPS is simple, just pick the character that does the most damage, done, easy video, you're welcome, I'm logging off. But obviously, what does that even mean? So early game, this is just going to be one single target DPS and one AoE DPS. I have Danhung and Himiko carrying me through everything, no problems. But you know, when putting together actual teams, like when we're thinking about what goes into a good team, something you want to take advantage of is enemy weakness, because when you hit a toughness break, you get your break effects, you get to move down the enemy's action value, and some DPSs like Himiko will do additional damage for targeting weaknesses. Additionally, before a fight and during a fight, you can press Z on any enemy and see their resistances, and you'll be able to see that some enemies actually have resistances to your damage type, making your hits less effective. While we're not going to go too much into something like penetration, simply swapping out a DPS for an element that targets an enemy's weakness is going to make the world of difference just in the speed of how quickly you can clear content. The same also goes for the Forgotten Hall, where you'll get these buffs like X element does % more damage, and again, it just seems obvious to prioritize a character of that relevant element for this content. When picking a DPS then, this is why we often see the recommendation of 1 to 2 DPS being a main single target DPS and your AoE DPS. The former is there to deal big damage sometimes regardless of weaknesses, while the AoE will actually capitalize on weakness breaking and deal continuous streams of damage to mobs. Usually most enemies have more than one weakness anyway, so it's pretty easy to match up this. For added bonus points, you can also pick support / shielders around enemies' weaknesses to speed up toughness breaking and help your DPSs get the job done quicker. But then how do we put all of this together? So, with all that said, I now have a ton of characters and I somehow need to get 10 different elemental DPSs on my team, I want 5 supports, and I want a shielder and a healer in my 4 slots. It's not going to happen. So putting this all together takes some of these core concepts and then brings it together in the most synergistic way for the content you're dealing with. So let's say I have 2 situations here. I'm going to build some teams for the 2 Echoes of War I have unlocked in the game. My first one being the Doomsday Beast, who is weak to physical, fire, ice, and wind. He resists control effects and he has a breakdown of 3 separate enemies to fight. Immediately, I'm going to pull in Danhung as my main DPS because he's strong and he deals wind damage, and then for shielder, I'm going to opt for Fire MC because if you don't know, all 3 of the guy's beast parts are weak to fire and the boss does deal AoE damage, so Fire MC is going to pull ahead a bit better than March for this fight. I'm putting Fire MC at the end for what I mentioned earlier, by the way. For slot 3 and 4, I have a few options now. Free to play only teams, I don't have my Himiko, but I do want to break the enemy's toughness, and because I have a group of enemies to bounce Asta's skill off, I'm going to double all in on the fire type and bring Asta for the attack speed buff. Finally, I'm going to bring Natasha as a support to keep everyone alive, and because it's a boss, I can forego the sub DPS because I'm a bit scared that he will hit too hard. Natasha takes advantage of some physical weakness, everyone's happy. Alternatively, let's look at a different Echo though, where I can't really opt in for a support with my free-to-play team, so Kokolia's boss fight. As a free-to-play player, my best option for DPS is going to be a combination of Xingque and Saval as they target her weaknesses. While I could use Danheng again, he is overall less effective here because I checked Kokolia's resistances before the fight and I can see she resists wind, and so now subbing him out makes a lot more sense. Additionally, she has a group weakness to fire, and then one of her lances is weak to lightning and one is weak to quantum, so this way I can actually use both AoE DPSs to be able to hit her and break her toughness down. I'm going to slot in Fire MC again for the same reasons as earlier. His taunt is now going to help massively, and surprise surprise, I'm going to bring Natasha along for the ride just to keep us all healed up. In this team comp, I'm now missing a support, but to be honest, that's fine. While Asta would fit right into here because the boss itself does have fire weakness, she does do a ton of damage against my characters and I need to be able to survive them. So you can see here where I'm opting to just raw dog with double DPS and then a shielder healer combo. Without going into too much detail though, my Kokolia team actually runs Himiko and Asta because I have the flexibility of Himiko being able to cover off on her own what Saval and Xingque are trying to do as 2 units. I could also swap in Huck for my Asta to just go in full on burn damage since I'm retaining my survivability in Fire MC and Natasha, but you can see when we start to look at team content itself, how some of the concepts of being able to juggle your offensive and defensive support in when relevant and when you have the ability to do so can actually help you determine which character is going to be the best use of your 4 slots. When fighting Kokolia, for example, because I know she hits hard, that's where I'm going to want to bring enemies who can do things like AoE attack and target weakness, and I'm just going to find myself being able to keep up momentum on my turns And so like I say, you can see where, depending on which characters you have, you can start to then weave in different units to do different jobs. To be honest, like I say, that's how I build my teams in a turn-based game like Honkai. For me, it is less about who on paper does the most amount of damage against something like a wooden pole with no resistances, and it's more about who is the best 4 to bring of who I have to clear what content. As you do more warps and summons, you will open yourself up to more and more combinations though, and so you'll be able to really expand your opportunities for team building. If you learned anything in this video, feel free to leave a like or a comment, or let me know your team comps and all that fun stuff. And if you enjoyed it, I will see you in the next one if you did like the content. Thanks as always, and goodbye. Go away, get away from here.